Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Bret Devereaux, who is Assistant Teaching Professor at the University of North Carolina. One thing Bret is famous for is his blog, which is called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry. It's extremely entertaining and amusingly written, but it's also massively detailed about life in the ancient world. And it concentrates very often on how the small details of everyday life actually impact on and control the big picture. And the range of subjects the blog covers is absolutely massive, and I can't easily summarize. But I'll just say that if you want to know exactly how cereals were produced in the ancient world, or you would like to read a revisionist take on Sparta and the Spartans, then that's the place to go. Anyway, welcome, Bret, to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Now, one of the things your blog does from time to time is you use fantasy literature as a way of talking about ancient history, and you did a very deep dive into Lord of the Rings. So I guess my first question was, what can a fictional Lord of the Rings tell us about ancient history?
I think that analyzing fiction through a historical lens, obviously it is fiction, but it provides a valuable window, I think, particularly for folks who might not realize that they like history, a valuable window for interrogating historical subjects and ideas. The overall purpose that I had in mind for the Helms Deep and Siege of Gondor series, which sort of go together, was to essentially construct a military history 101 sort of set of concepts and lessons in the context of a campaign that readers of fantasy would be familiar with. Within the discipline of military history, there's a really common, particularly in military training, you'll do this as a staff ride, it's very common to analyze a campaign or a single battle as a way of elucidating key concepts and so on. And essentially, this is an effort to use a fictional battle to do so. I think The Lord of the Rings is particularly handy in this way because of Tolkien's own experiences, both in that as he himself was a professor of Old English literature, he's very familiar with how pre-modern societies function. And so there is often a lot of really good detail that you can use as a jumping off point to talk about how these communities produce goods, how they survive, how they're organized, how they view the world. And on the other hand, of course, he was himself a veteran of the First World War. He had the experience of combat, and he brings that to his work as well. And so it makes it a particularly valuable framework because you're not always, as you would be with a lot of other things, you're not always just saying, this is wrong, let me tell you how. Occasionally you're saying, this is interestingly right, and let me tell you how and give you historical examples that are similar to what we are reading or seeing.
And you say Tolkien was in the First World War. Was he an officer in the war? What was his role?
Yes, he was an infantry officer. His unit fought at the Somme. He himself was frequently ill, though he did see combat. His frequent illness is probably why he survived the war. Most of his unit was not so lucky. Obviously, casualties among infantry units on the Western Front could be very high. And it's clear that it affected him deeply. In one of his letters, he notes that nearly all of his boyhood friends died in the war, that he lost those people. And I do think, and this is one of the sort of pleas I make briefly, I think it's in the Siege of Gondor series, but I actually think that in particular, that the Lord of the Rings deserves to be entered into the sort of canon of World War I literature next to All Quiet on the Western Front and Death's Men and so on as a meditation of that kind of war. I mean, particularly Frodo's ruminations on the trauma of war at the end of the story and his need to go to the West. But also, I have this section header, the Psalm of Gondor, in the ways that the Siege of Gondor, the emotions and even the actions the armies are taken are influenced by Tolkien's own experience of the First World War. The description of the zigzag trenches closing on the walls and artillery being moved into position has a little bit less to do with pre-modern siegecraft, but a lot to do with Tolkien's own experiences. on the Western Front, and he brings that with him. There is a way, and I think this is something the movies actually managed to capture fairly well, that all of the violence and the battles in The Lord of the Rings, they are mournful. They are regrettable events. Characters you like die, and there is this bittersweet sense to the victory won, that it's a victory won, but things are lost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rooted all over the work. The Entwives are lost and are not going to be rediscovered. The glory that was Gondor of old, right? Aragorn's going to have a good run, but there are ruined cities and empty houses, and of course the final victory means the diminishing of the elves and the sort of fading of magic from the world of Middle-earth. And one can't help but see in Tolkien this, that having won the First World War, the thing that he loved the most, which comes out very clearly in his letters, is the British countryside. That they won the war, but pastoral rural Britain was not saved, right? And so, victory was bittersweet. And this is a common element in World War I literature from that lost generation. Whether you won or you lost, there is this persistent question of wounds and trauma, and was it worth it? And The Lord of the Rings certainly fits into that space.
Okay, so what you and I agreed beforehand to do was to try, it's not possible to disentangle them completely, but to try and split our discussion into the Two Towers on the one hand, and in particular, as you say, the Battle of Helm's Deep, and then go on to talk about the Siege of Gondor and sort of try and split this into two halves. And as I say, there'll be lots of crossover, I think, but that's the basic idea. And our plan is, we thought we'd record these as separate episodes, so we'll do mainly Helm's Deep this week and mainly Gondor in the next episode, and hopefully that will keep things manageable for us and for the listeners. So I'm going to start off kind of breaking that rule because it's a crossover question, but one book I very much enjoyed is John Keegan's The Mask of Command, and he asks a question right at the start of that book, which is, do you lead from the front? Always, sometimes, or never? And so my question to you is, what do the characters in The Lord of the Rings do, the main characters, and why do they do it? And how does that compare with what characters in ancient history actually did?
Right, and you can see different leadership styles. Obviously, Denethor makes a point of saying that he leads from the back, spending even his own sons, as he puts it. Though, of course, he spends his sons by sending them to lead in the front, a recognition that someone needs to do it. Gandalf tends to also be a sort of lead from the back kind of character. He's in the fighting, but he's not out in front of the army. Theoden and Aragorn and Éomer are all lead from the front characters. Sauron himself is a lead from the back kind of disembodied eye. And so you do get this mix. I mean, Tolkien, I think, has some lead from the front preferences. I think probably bubbling out of both his own war experience, certainly the general sort of popular British understanding in his day of the First World War was, as the phrase goes, lions led by donkeys. That the British generals in the back, that Haig in his chateau had made terrible mistakes that he might not have made had he actually been at the site of the fighting. Modern military historians tend to dispute that, but it certainly influences Tolkien's view.
And I guess the least sympathetic characters like Denethor and Sauron certainly are the ones who lead from the back, right?
Right. No, and I think that this is relevant. Although we do see other leaders who are clearly good leaders, but less militarily active, particularly among the elves, right? It's hard to imagine Galadriel leading an army from the front, but she's clearly a good ruler. I think Tolkien has this sort of potentially broad view of what a good ruler can look like, and it doesn't always mean a great warrior.
And it's interesting, the elves, though, isn't it? Because in this book, they really don't figure in the war. I guess the war comes to them in various places, but they don't take part either in Helm's Deep. They do in the film, but that kind of is bolted on in a rather strange way. And they don't in Gondor. And the elves, though, are probably the most powerful force on Middle-earth. So it's quite strange, that.
Yeah, and there are lines concerning it. I think Legolas muses that his and Gimli's people have no need to march to war. because war will march to their homelands. And of course, appendix readers will note that he is correct, that does in fact happen. Sauron's operational plan is complex, and it involves spoiling attacks on any major power that could come to the aid of Gondor to make sure that they're forced to hold their forces in place. Interestingly, because the World War I connections keep coming back, it occurs to me that this was, in theory, the plan of the final phases of Ludendorff's spring offensive, that he would attack the French in order to convince them to stay put so that he could finally destroy the British. He never launches that final destructive attack because the balance of strength shifts against him before he can get it off. But this, idea of I'm going to attack these people to make them sit still was a piece of World War I operational thinking. Going back to the question of command, I think it's an interesting one. Speaking historically, the answer is that what a general looks like and what a general does is very culturally loaded and very culturally contingent. Certainly in some cultures, there is an expectation that the general or the king, often that's the same person, is to lead in front. Medieval monarchs were generally expected to be exceptional warriors, to be out in the front. But this is true even if you look at, for instance, late Bronze Age Egypt. The pharaoh was expected to be in his chariot at the head of the army, not in the back. And he needed to be out there. Of course, Egyptian royal inscriptions tend to flatter the pharaoh, so he's invariably destroying whole armies by himself. But he was expected to be out there and doing that. And, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian companion cavalry is the striking force for the Macedonian army. It's arrayed as a giant wedge, and Alexander the Great is at the point of the wedge. That is where the king goes. On the flip side, Roman generals are not generally at the point of the wedge. Roman generals are in the back. They have a battle to manage, and that's the expectation. And the cultural loading here is important because you have to imagine that those soldiers in that army, they come to the battlefield with an idea of what good generalship looks like. And it's going to be their culturally loaded idea. So the Macedonians come to the battlefield, and for them, good generalship looks like being at the front of the wedge. If Alexander were anywhere else, they would be concerned, right? Is he planning on running away? Is something wrong? Mm-hmm. On the flip side, a Roman soldier, if their general puts himself out in front like that at the beginning of a battle, they might, ironically, also be concerned. Are things desperate? Is our general just crazy? How is he going to manage the battle and give orders from the front? It is, after all, if you are in the action, you are going to have a hard time giving orders to the rest of the army. If you want to control the battle, you really do need to be generally in the back. And so these expectations are very, very culturally laid. And so, Tolkien has essentially, with Gondor, a general in the back culture where, there are officers in the front like Faramir, captains that go forward, but the soldiers of Gondor clearly expect the sort of coordinating command generally to be in the back. And then you have the Rohirrim, who are clearly a general in the front culture, where the expectation is that the general leads from the front. And I have to imagine this is a product in part that I think it's fairly clear. The Rohirrim are essentially Anglo-Saxons put on horses in Tolkien's mind in terms of their cultural setup, in terms of the language he uses to describe them. I mean, even to the point of Theoden's Golden Hall, Meduseld, is essentially Heorot, the Great Hall from Beowulf, the poem that Tolkien probably studied the most. And obviously, that was a general in front culture.
But just to ask about that Anglo-Saxon point, I had in my mind, and I don't quite know where I got this from, maybe I picked something from your blog, maybe I picked it from somewhere else, I can't remember, but I thought that Rohan was something to do with the Carolingians.
I think there is influence there as well. In some ways, when you take Anglo-Saxons and you put them on horses, you naturally get a system that looks quite a lot like the Carolingians. They are contemporaries, after all. We're talking about, 800s, 900s CE. And in a way, they have similar mobilization systems that then evolve in different directions, in part because of the primacy of cavalry in the Carolingian system versus the continued importance of infantry in the Anglo-Saxon system. And then you get to watch those two systems collide at Hastings. Very significant battle, but also, I should note, a very near-run thing. It is not hard to imagine a situation in which it is the Anglo-Saxon system based on infantry that comes out the winner at Hastings, and we would have a rather different history. But yes, I think in both cases there is this sense, if we want to talk about the army of Rohan for a bit, Tolkien has managed this sense that the army of Rohan functions somewhat like what the Anglo-Saxon feared, or the what we sometimes call the Carolingian select levy is the term that gets used, in that there is still this expectation that military service is owed by essentially all free men to the king and to the broader group that the king represents. Sometimes this is phrased as the nation in arms, although I tend to be queasy about using the word nation in a pre-modern concept. Nationalism is a modern thing. Pre-modern people don't generally think about things that way. And so the idea here is that when you would go to war, the military-aged free men of the community would be called up in a general levy to go to war with that. By Charlemagne, and particularly late in Charlemagne's reign, what we can see is that for the Carolingians, that sort of general conscript levy of the whole population is beginning to decline in importance, and it's beginning to atrophy. And it's beginning to atrophy because more and more importance is being placed on the mounted aristocracy as the decisive arm of battle, something that doesn't happen for the Anglo-Saxons. And so in this sense, while Rohan is very much conditioned on Anglo-Saxon culture, its military system, you're right, somewhat more resembles this sort of transitional stage in the Carolingian military system where infantry is still there and significant. Cavalry hasn't taken over entirely yet, but the stages of transition are clearly in place.
Now let's move into Helms Deep a bit. And could you say, and this is something that's always slightly perplexed me when I read history, is that castles and fortresses are clearly very important, although in fairness, in ancient history you don't seem to see castles so much, although you do see fortified towns. So what is the significance of a castle? Why can't you just say, okay, they're hidden in there, they're doing me no damage, I'll just leave them to it? Right.
This is a great question. We should separate, first, right, yeah, fortified towns and castles can serve some of the same purposes, but in a key way that they're different, of course, is that a fortified town, the economic center is in the fortification. Whereas for a castle, that's clearly not the place. So for a fortified town, the answer to your question is a little bit more obvious, right? The economic center, the administrative apparatus, the tax collection, the granaries, all of the good stuff that you want to capture is in the town walls. So you have to get in there to do that. For a castle, of course, that's not the case. It's not a population center generally. It is not necessarily a major economic center. Some castles are. Helms Deep clearly isn't. And so it's a good question. Why do you need to take that castle? And the answer has to do with the operations of what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is assert control over the land around the castle. But so long as the castle is untaken and there is a cavalry force in it that can raid out of it, you're never really going to be able to, for instance, extract revenue and taxes from the farmers in the land around the castle. You're never going to be able to extend a supply line past the castle gate because, of course, those cavalrymen in the castle will come out and raid your supply lines. In the context of Helms Deep, this is actually really well done. Helms Deep sits at sort of the southern end of the River Eisen on the Rohan side, and so it essentially sits just south of and watching the major transportation route that Saruman's army has to use to get to the broader open lands of Rohan, because they have to cross at the ford in the Eisen. And so, from a military perspective, Saruman can march past Helms Deep, but if he does so, he's leaving a dangerous army in his rear, which might show up when he wouldn't like it to. And he's running his supply lines directly past that dangerous army. And so when you look at the Helms Deep campaign from Saruman's point of view, and I'm sure we'll get to this, he hasn't planned it very well. But once Rohan's army arrives in Helms Deep, he has a tricky choice of evils. If he marches past them and does nothing, he's kept his army concentrated, that's good, but he's left a large army in his rear, and if he then arrives, say, for instance, at Edoras and has to lay siege to that, having Theoden's army show up unexpectedly behind him could end your campaign very quickly and in a very unpleasant way.
That sounds a bit like the Battle of Adrianople to me.
Right. No, it could go very ugly very quickly. On the other hand, obviously, laying siege to Helms Deep might mean his army sitting out there for months, or a costly effort to storm the keep, which is what he ends up doing, and it works out poorly. The intermediate option would be to split your army, to drop a force just large enough to keep Theoden trapped in Helms Deep, and move the rest of the army forward to continue with the operation. The potential danger there is that this means dividing your forces, potentially rendering you vulnerable to defeat in detail. And Saruman's big problem here is that Theoden's army isn't the only army Rohan has in the field in the books. Erkenbrand has an infantry force which has survived the clash at the fords, and Gandalf is going to gather it up, and it shows up at the end of the battle to save the day. A role filled by Éomer in the film, but it's Erkenbrand in the books. And so Saruman's miscalculations very early in the campaign has put him in a devil of a situation where he has two armies that he needs to manage. And finally, because of his strategic position, he has to do all of this very quickly.
So why does he have to do it quickly, sorry?
Yeah, he has to do all of this very quickly because by this point, he has already burned his bridge with Mordor, which is a really bad strategic decision. And as a result, he needs to conquer and secure Rohan before Gondor falls. Otherwise, he's going to be halfway through the conquest of Rohan when the Witch King's 100,000 orc army rolls up the road and stomps him flat. And so his operational timetable is extremely tight due to really quite bad decisions that he made very early on in the campaign. And I have, if you know, folks are also readers, I have a wonderful flow chart in my blog series where I walk through his various decisions and the condition he's put himself in and note that he essentially needs to pull the inside straight here. He's put himself in a situation where he has essentially 2 or 3 plans all moving in parallel, all of which need to succeed perfectly. This kind of intricate clockwork strategic plan where any failure or disruption at any point results in the complete failure of the plan, which I think, one, absolutely fits the character of sort of Saruman, the man who has a mind of metal and gears he makes overly intricate machines, he makes overly intricate plans. I find that eminently believable from a character standpoint. I also, quite frankly, find it believable from a military history standpoint. This tendency to create these over-elaborate plans that simply cannot be carried out by mortal men in practical circumstances is a problem that strategic thinkers fall into. Folks who want a really good example of this, I do recommend Partial and Tully's Shattered Sword on the Battle of Midway, which goes into the absolutely bonkers Japanese naval plan, which involved 6 different formations being redistributed across each other at various points, working on a timetable that involved very little delay and made heroic assumptions about what the U.S. Navy would do. And as a consequence, it created this plan where if anything went wrong, the entire plan would come apart. And in the end, something went wrong. The American aircraft carriers weren't where they were supposed to be. And the entire plan went catastrophically wrong. Japan loses 4 of its 6 fleet carriers in a day. Sort of catastrophic error. from an overly complex plan that did not allow for, as the old military maxim goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
So they roll up to Helms Deep. And just one question, and coming back perhaps to another series on your blog, which was about Sparta, and it always struck me that the Spartans never attempted to, as far as I know, they certainly didn't succeed in breaching the long walls of Athens, which are these long, long walls. I don't know what they are, 11 miles down, and they're double fronted. And I looked at Helms Deep and I thought, gee, that wall doesn't look so very tall. So how tall were walls in the ancient world, and how tall might we expect the walls at Helms Deep to be if they were realistic?
Wall height varies, and wall thickness varies depending on what exactly the set of threats you're looking at. There's a sort of a tension in wall construction. You're worried about two major problems, right? Breach and escalade. So your enemy can do two things. They can go over the top of the wall, or they can bash their way through the wall. For escalade, obviously, you just want to make the wall as tall as humanly possible, as high as you can make it. And since you have a limited amount of resources and labor time, that's going to mean tall, thin walls. That's how you make escalade very difficult. We tend to think of, and certainly this is what Saruman's forces attempt to do, escalade in terms of ladders. As often it would be something like building large ramps just up the side of the wall with a lot of labor, if you had that kind of labor to do escalade. But you could do ladders, you could do movable towers. But of course, the taller the wall is, the less feasible that becomes. 20, 30-foot tall ladders are tough things to build in position. On the flip side, if your worry is that an enemy intends to breach your walls, and they could do this by obviously using some kind of artillery to bash them down, they could roll some kind of ram directly up to the walls and attempt to bash their way through the wall itself. It would take a long time, but you could do it. They could attempt to dig under the wall and then collapse that tunnel and thereby collapse the wall into the hole that they've made, undermining. All of these efforts to resist that kind of breach, you would want a thick wall. And of course, resources being limited, your thick wall would be shorter. And so we see a shift in these sort of construction techniques. If we look at the ancient world, by, for instance, the Roman period, we are seeing an emphasis in Greek and Roman siegecraft that does tend to emphasize walls of some meaningful thickness. The Greeks are the inventor of the catapult. Bashing down a wall with a Greek or Roman catapult would take an awful long time, but it was potentially doable. Undermining was doable as well. And so we might see that sort of ancient walls tend to have this kind of balance between escalade resistance and breach resistance. In terms of actual scale, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, represent essentially the summit, the sort of greatest set of city walls that the Romans ever built. And they're fairly massive. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think the main wall is something like 30 feet high and about 20 feet thick, with a secondary wall out in front of it, something that Helms Deep secondary wall is weirdly placed, and we can come back to that. The dike, I don't quite get what the dike is doing, but it has a secondary wall in front of it to make it hard to approach the primary wall. And the part of the secondary wall's goal, interestingly, is the secondary wall isn't actually very high, this outer wall. Its job is to prevent enemy artillery from having a clear line of fire on the base of the inner wall, which is where you would want to score your hits to collapse it. So it's meant to foil artillery firing. And so that's a sort of a 30 feet scale. I mean, that's a big wall. As we move into the Middle Ages in Europe, we see an increased emphasis in siege work to, both just generally to starving places out rather than storming them. The Romans tended to prefer to storm rather than starve. In the Middle Ages, armies are smaller, and it makes more sense to starve rather than storm. But also, medieval castles are very much oriented against escalade. A part of this is just that the raw numbers of catapults, especially early in the Middle Ages, that these armies can put in the field to potentially batter down towers and bash up the defenses is less, because these are smaller and sometimes less sophisticated polities. And so medieval castle walls, if you look at them even in comparison to ancient city walls, they are very high and very thin to resist escalade. And so in some cases, they are higher than the walls we see at a place like Constantinople, but much, much thinner. And then sort of to give us this sort of final example to push past the pre-modern period into the early modern period, the advent of cannon make those very high, very thin walls a fairly terrible idea. Because cannon can crack through them very quickly. And we see the emergence first in Italy, and it then spreads across Europe, of what's called the Tres Italienne, or sometimes just star forts, if you're familiar with star forts, which tend to have comparatively low, flat, sloped walls that are backed up by earthworks, often very thick earthworks. I mean, in some cases, this is the wall of the fort is really just a retaining wall for all this earth to absorb the impact of cannon shot. And of course, so those lower walls are much less concerned about escalade. By this point, the defenders have guns. So running up with a ladder to a wall that has musketeers all along it is not a great plan. You're going to get shot. And so the concern is less escalade and more, again, the walls being destroyed. So in the case of all of this is a very long story. In the case of Helms Deep, Helms Deep is an old fortress. And, in Middle-earth, technology kind of weirdly runs backwards sometimes.
Yes.
The wall is described as stout. Its only weakness being the culver that lets the actual stream that runs through it out. And so, I would suspect from Helms Deep probably something more like an ancient city wall, more like the Theodosian walls, fairly thick, quite high, very robust. Obviously, the deeping wall is breached by what is, I think we're pretty clearly meant to understand, is a potentially magically enhanced gunpowder charge, which is a pretty big thing to hit the wall with.
Yeah. Oh man.
And so, it's clearly fairly robust. Just to loop back briefly to your question of why the Spartans didn't crack at the long walls. So the Greeks generally, I'm just going to say this, in the classical period prior to Alexander, the Greeks generally are rubbish at siegecraft. They're not good at it. And the Spartans are bad at it by Greek standards. Because Spartan logistics are very poor, and one of the things you need to do to successfully carry out a siege is to be able to have an army stationary in enemy territory for a long period of time, which is a major logistical challenge.
Which the Spartans aren't
aren't able to do, right? The Spartans invade Athens for 6 more or less consecutive years, and at no point during that do they resolve the logistical problem of operating in Athens, in Athenian territory, not in the city, but in Athenian territory. And so they have to go home every year because they run out of supplies. And, the Spartan army is so traditional that it takes half a decade before they're like, maybe we should put a supply depot out here. And the war, actually, that stage of the war ends before they do it. They'll do it in the next war, which is just a head-scratching instance of Spartan operational incompetence, but not the only instance of Spartan operational incompetence, as it turns out.
One thing I wanted to talk about, and we talked about it a little bit, is leaders performing leadership. And I was very struck in the films just how poorly Peter Jackson treated this, because he shows Aragorn as sort of moaning throughout about how they're all going to die and they don't have enough men to defend the place and it's all a disaster. And I was just thinking, this is just the kind of leader you really don't want to have around if you're trying to hold a desperate situation from the enemy.
Right. And this is really interesting. And I think in the books, leadership is a much more significant part of this whole exchange. And it comes from a number of different people, right? Aragorn is exemplifying leadership, but so is Eomer and Theoden. In the course of this, they all have kind of leadership moments that they do. I think, Peter Jackson, he wants to kind of keep the movie moving, and every scene needs to have some conflict in it. And so he develops this sort of conflict between kind of, you've got like sad sack Aragorn and then like sad sack Theoden bouncing off of each other in odd ways. And in some ways, it sort of diminishes in the book what is essentially kind of a master class in a certain form of leadership. And I should note that I think modern writing and military theory tends to be somewhat less focused on the role of the general. But pre-modern military writers in the ancient world, in the medieval world, with whom Tolkien would have been incredibly familiar, are almost monomaniacally obsessed with the importance of leadership as the thing that holds an army together. And this is no accident. Literature in the ancient and medieval European world is by and large produced by military aristocrats and their family members for military aristocrats and their family members. It's no surprise that they're focused on the part of the battle that is their role, leadership. So they attribute battlefield success to good leadership, the thing they can control, and battlefield failure to bad leadership, the thing that they control. And this makes a degree of sense. And modern military historians tend to be more focused on cohesion among common soldiers and so on. That said, right, Tolkien is not some chicken hawk sitting in his study. This is a man who led men in battle, and as are our ancient and medieval sources. And I think sometimes their emphasis on leadership is gainsaid when it shouldn't be. When, probably they know what they're talking about here, and that really personal leadership mattered. And Lord knows if you talk to actual serving officers, they will tell you this too, that personal leadership matters. One way you see this come out in both the narrative and also in historical sources, of course, is the general speech. Mm. And these days, like, the general speech is, it shows up in movies. And then I invariably get asked by my students in some cases, do they actually give these speeches? Could anyone hear these speeches? Is this just a movie thing? So the first thing to note, our sources for the ancient and medieval world are full of these speeches, absolutely full of these speeches. They are a standard part of battle narratives. There is a standard structure to them, to the point where Ted Lendon actually, in one of his articles, I cite it in the blog post if people want to look it up, gives a sort of like, here is the standard structure of tropes. And I actually do that. I go like battle speech through the numbers. Here's what it looks like. There's actually one ancient writer, Sallust, essentially kind of makes a rhetorical point in his narrative by giving his villain what is clearly just an extremely standard by the numbers general speech. Kind of, and he's delighting in the irony that his villain is capable of performing good Roman generalship. Mm-hmm. And the sort of, look, like he's, the villain is a formidable opponent sort of moment.
I was very struck in the general speeches how it was standard practice both to say, we are fantastically strong, we are brave, we're whatever, but the enemy are also ferocious.
Right.
And I was quite taken by that. The enemy are not downplayed in these standard speeches.
Right. No, the sort of the standard setup, just to go through like the standard sets, is you generally have an opening that focuses on the valor and strength of the soldiers rather than like the impact of the speech. And there's often the super common trope is how brave men require few words, which I think is a line that Catiline actually gives, or that Sallust gives Catiline, but it shows up in a lot of places. Brave men require few words. It's in Thucydides. Then a description of the dangers arrayed against them. And this is where you lay it out. The enemy is going to fight fiercely. They're big and scary, and they have all of these advantages. And as the general, you're saying that because your soldiers know that, right? They're not stupid. These guys that are your, frontline soldiers, they know that the enemy is skilled and strong and well equipped and well armed and all these other things. And so if you pretend that's not the case, you're just going to lose credibility. So you're going to admit to all of that. You're going to say, look, they're very well trained. They're battle hardened. They have good equipment. They're going to fight hard, whatever advantages it is that they have, whatever is scary about them. And then the third step is to then emphasize the profits to be gained in victory and the dire consequences of defeat. Here's why we need to fight them anyway, even though they're very scary, because freedom is under threat. Rome will be destroyed. They have a city full of riches we want to loot. All of these sorts of things. This is your opportunity to quote Macaulay here, to invoke the ashes of your fathers and the altars of your gods. And then following that, we get to the general lays out the basis on which the general believes that victory is possible. And this is the point where you say, okay, I've already talked about their advantages. I've talked about why we need to win. Here's why we can win. So he's brought up the fear. He's brought up the stakes. And now he's going to diffuse that fear by explaining, look, I've considered their advantages. Here is our plan. And that might mean laying out the battle plan that neutralizes enemy advantages. It might mean pointing to your own advantages that neutralize enemy advantages, this kind of thing. And then finally, typically a big moving emotional punctuation mark at the end of the speech. And what I did in the blog series was, rather than breaking down an ancient speech this way, although I invite listeners to go read Sallust's Catilinarian Conspiracy, Catiline's battle speech.
I did. It was a good speech.
It's a good speech. It moves through these by the numbers. But I broke down a modern speech, Dwight Eisenhower's speech to the Allied Expeditionary Force before D-Day, and I actually I have up a diagram of the speech color-coded by the sections as he moves through them, almost in exact order. He shifts them around slightly, but it's a point for point, and this form of speech, and you can see why it's rhetorically potent, even though, as Lendon notes, it's a fairly dry, fairly rote genre. I think Lendon quips, if folks here haven't read any of Ted Lendon's writings, Soldiers and Ghosts is go get that book. It's on Greek and Roman kind of war ideology and soldier ideology, the values that they had, but it also describes how they fight very well. It's probably the best introductory primer onto Greek and Roman warfare that I could recommend. Lendon has a way with words, and he has a quip, something to the effect that general speeches are sort of dry, unbuttered toast. Of ancient speeches, they're not meant to be rhetorically complex, but even this, I think, and here I think he misses a trick, this is a device too. That dry, unbuttered toast approach is a way of building credibility. It's the everyday country lawyer approach. I'm not that sophisticated. I'm not that smart or hoity-toity. I'm telling it to you straight. Here is my not very rhetorically embellished, very standard speech. And it also must have been reassuring for the soldiers. Here is a blandly predictable speech. In any event, there are all sorts of questions that historians are still trying to answer about how these speeches were given. Obviously, one person can't shout loud enough for a 10,000-man army to hear them. Were they written out? Were they sort of recited in front of each unit? I mean, this is how Eisenhower's D-Day speech was done. It was to be read to every unit. In many cases, we don't know. What we do know is that the ancients thought these speeches were terribly important, and that I think we can conclude from their prominence, they clearly gave them. Yeah. That they were clearly doing this, even if we don't quite have the logistics as to how. They're definitely doing this. And so they definitely thought it mattered. And going back to your point about generalship from the front, from the back, soldiers, you're standing in the line, you're standing in a mass of men, right? A soldier on the field, whether in ancient warfare or modern, he can't see the battle plan. He isn't seeing majestic lines moving across the map. So if you're a soldier, right, but you're still trying to gauge, does my general know what he's doing? Should I put my trust in this guy? You're going to gauge that based on how is he performing generalship. That's going to impact your morale and your thinking. And so for the soldier to see his general performing the general speech in the accepted way, in the way that the soldier expects it to be performed, in the way it was performed in the stories he's heard and in the other battles he may have been in, that's going to be comforting. Well, this guy knows what he's doing. He's doing the speech properly. And yeah, Peter Jackson kind of mangles that element a little bit in Helms Deep, and it's one of the elements of the construction of Helms Deep that disappoints me. In a weird way, the beats of the scene replicate the progression of the general's speech, but it isn't intentional by any of the characters, and Jackson doesn't seem to know he's doing it, which I thought was a disappointing missed opportunity.
Yeah. And we should press on, I guess.
Right.
We covered a lot, but there's still a bit to go. Well, there's two things in particular I wanted to talk about, and this is something you talk about in your blog, which I thought was terribly interesting, is that there is a structural weakness to the Orc army that Saruman doesn't seem to have got his head around.
Right, the absence of cohesion and the absence of a good source of cohesion. Right, so Saruman has literally brewed up this army. He has created it kind of whole cloth. And he's told them that they're all terribly powerful and strong and so on, and then he sent them into battle. And certainly in the film, they're very well armed and armored. I mean, some of the prop work isn't great, but like they're wearing plate armor, which is quite impressive. In the book, they're not quite that heavily armored, but the reports we get treat them as very well equipped for the standards of the day. And yet, of course, this army just completely falls apart the moment it faces adversity. And here I think Tolkien is being quite clever. So when we talk about armies and we look at historical armies, one of the features we look at is what we call cohesion, the moral forces that hold an army together on the battlefield. And here I think it's sometimes easy to be misled. People think in terms of propaganda and the cause and love of country. All of those things are important. They will get you to the battlefield. They will not keep you together under fire. All of those high notions of the cause you're fighting for and all of that stuff is ushered swiftly out of your head the moment someone starts shooting at you. And the terror of the battlefield takes hold, and you need something more primal to keep soldiers together under pressure. And we generally refer to that thing as cohesion. There are a number of different ways of building cohesion. The army of Rohan builds cohesion by relying on the social bonds of peacetime to hold people together in war. That, whether it's the knights of Theoden's house, the aristocrats who are fighting alongside their fellow aristocrats and would not want to be shamed before their fellow aristocrats, something that gets brought up in dialogue by some of the characters, that feeling of shame before their comrades that they don't want to experience. The one thing human beings fear more than death is shame. Or for the common soldiers, it seems pretty clear that when the infantry, like Erkenbrand's troops, and Theoden has some of these guys too, when the infantry is raised, they're raised probably by their villages and by their regions. We know that Rohan is broken up into various sort of military regions. Erkenbrand is in command in the Westfold. Éomer is in command in another area of Rohan. And so their infantry are probably locals. They're probably fighting alongside their family members and their neighbors. And so what causes Rohan's army to cohere is when you're fighting next to your brother, your neighbor, your cousin, your best friend, you don't want to be shamed before them and you don't want to let them down. If you run away, you're leaving them in peril. And that moral force, right, speaks to our tribal animal brain in a much more vivid way than "we are fighting for freedom" does. That force will keep you together.
And you made another point, which is that Rohan's army is stuffed filled with natural leaders, people who have leadership positions just from civilian life. Right.
No, the leaders in war are the leaders in peace, which means they have natural authority and legitimacy. And these common soldiers, when things get weird, when things are going wrong, they're going to naturally look to the people that they look to in peacetime to resolve disputes and collect taxes and do all that stuff. They're going to rally around those people. They're going to say, "Éomer, you seem to know what's going on. What should we do?" And in the event, right, when the wall is breached, Éomer is able to put together a hunk of these guys in a shield wall and walk them back into the caverns and hold his ground. They cohere. They don't break up. They don't run away. They gather up around Éomer, around Aragorn, around Theoden, around these other leaders, around Erkenbrand, and they hold together, and as a result, they win. Now, on the flip side, the Uruks fall apart. I mean, they just utterly fall apart. Even after Erkenbrand arrives, the Uruks wildly outnumber their opponents. They're in a strong operational position, but the moment things start going badly, they fall apart. Why? They don't cohere. And the answer here, I think, is that Saruman hasn't thought through the psychology of his soldiers. So he has vat bred these Uruks. They have not had time. They have not had the decades of living in villages with each other, of farming with each other, to build the kind of natural cohesion that the Rohirrim have. That's not necessarily fatal, because you can build cohesion in the unit. And the Western system for doing this, though it's also, interestingly, the ancient Chinese system for doing this, is through discipline and drill. That you put these soldiers through a long process of training where they're both learning to use their weapons and to do specific kinds of usually formation-based warfare. But you're also putting them together, putting them under stress, and putting them under a sense of shared suffering and shared experience, which is going to bind them together. It's going to begin creating that bond inside of their units, which are going to hold these guys together when the going gets tough, because essentially they'll be that, to borrow the Shakespeare phrase, that band of brothers. They'll be knitted together by the experience of their training. And the advantage to this kind of method of forming armies is that it scales. You can only get so big with a natural cohesion army before you've got people who they don't know each other and they don't know, why should I die for that guy over there? I have no idea who he is.
Yeah.
But that cohesion by discipline and drill does scale up. It can scale up, obviously, to the very massive armies of the modern period. The downside, of course, is that it does require you to do it. You need to drill these troops together for a long period of time. You need, generally, you're going to need more officer for this kind of cohesion to work, particularly non-commissioned officers as well as commissioned officers. So you need not just lieutenants, you need sergeants, because soldiers need to build trust in their sergeants to have someone to rally around. This is going wrong. Sarge, what do we do?
Yeah.
Right. And Sarge needs to have an answer. So he needs to be trained for leadership. And that process takes time. And so while Rohan's army arrives at the battlefield and seems to cohere naturally, for this disciplined form of cohesion, Saruman needs time, and he hasn't done it. It's clear that he has not put in the time and work. You know, you can pick through the appendices to try and get the dates, but it's clear that this army just isn't like drilling 24/7 when Gandalf shows up at Isengard to ask for Saruman's advice, because Gandalf doesn't see them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not there, right? There isn't some great armed camp. And so Saruman has thrown this army together. In the book, it is a much more diverse force, which increases the problems, because he hasn't taken the time to get all of those units to practice together, and to not only weld them internally, but then weld them to each other. And so Saruman hasn't done the homework to build cohesion in his force. He's counting on the fact that his Uruks are big and strong and heavily armored and scary. And he's told them that they're big and strong and heavily armored and scary, but he hasn't done the work to make them cohere. And so you put them in a tough situation, and lo and behold, they fall apart.
Okay, so let's try and wrap things up and maybe take it to the end where poor old Saruman is sitting looking out over the wreckage of Isengard. And one thing I found very striking is that Gandalf gives him the chance to surrender on good terms, and to rejoin the good guys, and to be in a much pleasanter position than he is sitting up in the tower completely in the midst of this complete devastation. And Saruman doesn't take it. And I'm just interested in that psychologically. I'm interested in it because I think back at World War II, where admittedly, the Germans and the Japanese aren't perhaps invited to give up on terms, but nonetheless they go on fighting long after it's in their interest to do so. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that aspect.
Yeah, I think there are a number of interesting strands here. I think that certainly Tolkien's own Christian theological background comes out. Gandalf is a semi-divine being. He's essentially the universe's equivalent of an angel. And it's not surprising that he is always the one offering the hand of mercy. He also, if you know, to jump to the other book, right? Gandalf is also willing to offer Sauron terms, which is really striking.
I've forgotten that.
Yeah, right. I mean, they have this parlay with the mouth of Sauron, and obviously, you know, to have the parlay, you have to think something might come of it. And indeed, they go forward, demanding the Lord of the Black Land come forth and let justice be done upon him, and let him abandon his evil works forever. Like this idea that they're going to have, like, they're going to at least offer a sort of war crimes trial of Sauron, and then we all move on, which obviously he doesn't accept. He should have. He would have survived.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, so part of this, I think, is sort of a Christian theological framework of the necessity of offering forgiveness. Part of it is also, quite frankly, practical. I think Gandalf knows that Saruman could still be useful. He could still save people. And part of it is compassion. I think the psychology of Saruman here is really interesting, because you're right. There is this tendency to see countries where the war is just clearly not going to turn out in any positive way, and to plan to just stick it out. We're just going to stick it out. We're going to go down with the ship. There is an enormous amount of debate, of course, surrounding the Japanese surrender, mostly surrounding the argument about the necessity or not of the use of atomic weapons and compelling the Japanese surrender. That said, the Japanese could have known that they were going to lose the war by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. Certainly by after Leyte, it would have been obvious that the United States was both going to be able and willing to invade the Japanese home islands. And likewise, at a relatively early point on the Eastern Front, if you're sitting in German strategic headquarters and making a rational calculation, you've got to see that once the momentum has run out, certainly after Kursk, there's no turning this around. And so why do they keep fighting? And I think this gets into the personal psychology of the people making the decisions, and often in ways where their personal interests and mental state departs from the interests of the community and the state.
Yeah.
If you are a high-ranking member of the Imperial Japanese military, to surrender rather than going down gloriously for the lost cause means to admit the mistake. It means to admit this was a dumb idea, we shouldn't have done it, and I brought ruin upon my country. And psychologically, I think that admission is just unacceptable to most people. To admit the mistake like that is often a thing that they're just not willing to do. And psychologically, in many cases, this is quite clear in World War II for both Germany and Japan, it was easier for these folks to go down with the ship. In some cases, like literally, you get sort of like the last sailing of the battleship Yamato, the most pointless military operation in World War II. There's no chance of success. It was just throwing 3,000 lives away for no reason. It is an operation that actually makes me angry to talk about.
Have you come across Jan Morris's book about the Yamamoto?
I don't think so.
It's a lovely piece of work. Maybe I will send it to you. It's a lovely piece of work and almost a poem. But yes, you are just overcome with the utter pointlessness of it. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, it's just frustrating because like these are 3,000 plus sailors that could have lived through the war, that could have had families and lives after it, that didn't need to die in a military operation that had no chance of success or changing the outcome of the war. But what motivated that is really interesting. And the answer was that, as far as we can tell, essentially, the emperor quite innocently asked a question. He's like, well, look, the Imperial Japanese Army is fighting on these islands. What will the Navy do? And to the shame to the Imperial Japanese Navy High Command, none of whom I might add were on the battleship, the shame of doing nothing while the army did the fighting compelled them to do something, to save their honor, which, I mean, really, I don't want to treat this as like honor in this like, oh, weird foreign concept. No. It's just like they felt bad And so they felt the need to do something, even if it was a stupid thing, so that they wouldn't feel bad anymore. And so bringing the edifice crashing down around them is a way of delaying the emotional reckoning of having made the mistake. And I think that that's a good point to make, because we see Saruman is trapped in that same emotional state. He is, as Gandalf says, gnawing at the end of old plots. He just refuses to admit the mistake. He refuses to admit the error, even though at that moment when Gandalf is offering him sanctuary, Saruman he knows he's burned his bridge with Mordor. Something Gandalf points out in the conversation, it's a line something like, other reasons may occur to you shortly. Like, your other friends you have cheated. So he knows he's burned that bridge. There's no going back on that one. He's obviously burned his bridge with Rohan. Like, Gandalf is offering him the obvious best choice, and he's torn about it. He has this moment where he thinks about it, but in the end, his arrogance and his pride, his need not to admit the mistake, masters him. And this is, I think, an important lesson for us both in doing strategy and in selecting strategic leaders, that arrogance and pride is a real flaw, that for a leader, the ability to admit the mistake is essential. And sort of to bring us back to Dwight Eisenhower, because everything comes back to Dwight Eisenhower. I like Ike, by the way. You want to talk about leadership. So we've talked about the D-Day speech Eisenhower gave. Eisenhower had another D-Day speech that he did not give, which was a speech that he had written in the event that the landings failed. And what he had written was, and I'll just quote it because I have it up. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And he folded that up and he put it in his pocket on D-Day, and he was waiting to have to give it if the operation failed, where he would take full responsibility. This was my mistake, right? That's leadership. That's a quality of leadership. And when you're selecting for leaders, you want an Eisenhower and not a Saruman. You want someone who will admit the mistake and make the best decision for the group, even if it means accepting responsibility themselves. And of course, this is something that I think many countries have seen very much lacking in their leaders of late, that they have picked fellows that are very puffed up and refuse to admit error. And, certainly when I think about leadership and I think about who is going to be a successful leader, one of the questions that I ask is, has this person ever hat in hand said, you know what? I made my decision based on the best information. It was a mistake. I made a mistake. I was wrong. Because you want that person as a leader. You want the person who will tell you they were wrong. And often we reward in our businesses, in our politics, we reward the people who never admit they were wrong. But,
Well, Saruman, in the end, he was paid out in due course, I suppose.
Right.
So, okay, well, look, so that's Helms Deep for this week.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Let's get together again soon.
Yes.
and do Gondor.
Absolutely.
But until then, thank you very, very much, Bret Devereaux, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Okay, take care. Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.